big day, but I'm sure you would be liking JDF as well as your stay in Jaipur. So this session is on lightning and reusable components. What we'll be discussing is a brief overview of what lightning experience is, how we develop custom functionalities for lightning experience, as well as how we break down complex lightning requirements into simple and reusable components. So for those of you guys who haven't started developing lightning components yet, this would be a jumpstart session wherein you can start knowing the basic building blocks and then start building your own lightning components. So to start with, my name is Nitin Goyal. I am a Salesforce technical consultant at Make Positive. I have a total of 6 years of experience as a developer, out of which last 2.5 years have been into Salesforce, mainly into Salesforce Lightning. I chose this topic because I love to work on lightning components. There is always something new to learn. With every release, Salesforce gives you new features, new components, new functionalities. So there is always something new to explore. That is why I took this topic. So before we start, let's get the agenda out first. So our agenda for today would be, first we'll be discussing what is lightning experience, why it was introduced, and how we develop custom functionalities for it. After which we'll be covering how we identify components from a complex requirement. Then we'll be covering the basic building blocks, and to cover these basic building blocks, we'll be taking a sample requirement and then linking these building blocks to that requirement. And lastly, we'll have a demo. So the first question is why Salesforce Lightning was introduced. Salesforce Lightning was introduced to provide a revamped UI and a faster user experience. Now when we say faster user experience, what I mean by it is, when we had Visualforce pages, we need to go back and forth between server and client to update our page, to update our logic, business logic which we process. But with Lightning components, we try to do most of the functionality on the client side itself. This is what makes the user response faster. Now, when Lightning was built, it was built on an open source framework called Aura. This Aura framework itself is a component and event driven framework. So when we develop custom functionalities for Lightning, we develop them in form of components and link those components together with events. Now it's not just that you will be building components and events. Lightning itself provides you drag and drop builders. So once you create a component, you can use the same component on multiple pages. Now it's as easy as dragging a component from the available list onto a page and then configuring it. So once you have developed the component, any admin can use your component onto the application. Apart from it, the Lightning experience also provides you a standard based design system with which you can make your components look identical to the standard Lightning experience. So this is what we get into what we get from Lightning. Now we need to know how we develop for Lightning. Now to move on to it, first thing is, how would we identify components in a requirement? So think of this house as a requirement. Now from a developer's perspective, if you see this house, you'll identify that there are roof, there are windows, there are doors, and there are walls. Now if you see, these components have been reused throughout the application. So this is what makes a potential component. Now when you see something which is being reused throughout the functionality, that is a potential component. So if we take this as a requirement, the potential component here is the windows, the doors, the roof, and the wall. So if we create a window once, we can use the same window for multiple rooms, and that is what reusability is. That is what component framework promotes. Now when we have discussed reusability and components, what are the basic building blocks when you are working for a Lightning requirement? The basic building blocks are components, events, and SLDs. Components being the functional units. So in the house requirement, the window is a component. Events are what links the component together. So if you want to ring a bell when door opens, so we'll fire an event from the door to the bell to make it ring. So that is the linking component between the two components. So if you want to link two components, we'll be using events. And lastly, SLDs. SLDs is like the paint on the house. It makes your house look beautiful, as well as it provides you additional functionalities. Now we will be covering all of these in detail. But to start with, let's take a sample requirement. Now consider this as a requirement that your customer is asking you to build a Lightning application wherein users have the ability to search other users as well as to search other accounts. Now the customer also wants that admin should have an ability to provide user the functionality to follow the search records. So if you are searching users, you see certain results, you can follow those users. Additionally, they also want that the result should be listed in either a grid layout or a list layout, and this would be controlled by admin, that what layout is shown by default, and then user can select his choice of the layout. So this is a sample requirement. Now when we'll be covering these building blocks, we'll link them back to this requirement so that we understand it in detail. Now we have seen the requirement. What would be our steps to build this requirement? So to build this requirement, it would be a 3-step process. The step 1 would be, we'll be identifying components from this requirement. So we have to build a Lightning application, but we need to see what components will build to achieve the entire functionality. Now the second step would be to wiring those components together. So we need to wire these components together so that they form the entire functionality, so that they work together in a symphony. And the last step would be, once you have the components ready and those are functional with each other, then your admin can just drag that component, your parent component, onto the app page so that it's available to the end users. So it's a 3-step process. Now we'll be covering the first building blocks. So the first building block was components. Now as discussed, the components are self-contained reusable units, and these are created to promote reusability as well as to decouple the functionality. So if you have a big functionality, you'll build it in pieces and then make them work together. So that is where components come into picture. Now a component is not just a single file. So in VF pages, you just had a VF page which had the HTML markup or any script that you wanted to write. But in a component, it's a bundle of files. That's why we call it a Lightning component bundle. Now if you see here, there are 8 files. I hope you can read this. I know the font is a little smaller, but what's important to us for this session is the first file, which is the component file. Now this file is required. This file contains the HTML markup, so this will contain the UI that you'll be seeing on your browser for the component. The second file is the style file. Now the style file contains your custom CSS classes which are being used in your HTML markup. Now we discussed that components were created to reduce the response time, to provide a faster user experience. Controller and helper files are the one which contain your JavaScript logic, and this is what makes the user experience faster. So you put all your JavaScript logic, all your client-side processing logic into these 2 files, and for most of the user actions you return the response from here itself. So you don't need to go back and forth between the server, and that is what reduces the response time. Now there are 4 more files, but those are not relevant to this session. The only relevant file from these 4 files would be the design file. So when I said step 3, which was your admin would be configuring the component onto an app page using builder, this design file is useful in that case. I'll show this in demo so that you understand what's the use of it. Now we have seen what a component contains, but how a component works. If you see this image, when I said component has 2 parts of the processing, the first part is the client-side processing. The client-side processing contains your view markup, which is your HTML and CSS file, and then your JavaScript logic, which is your helper and controller file. So this JavaScript logic is that logic which we have moved from our server side to the client side to improve the user experience, to reduce the response time. And we still need to go to the server for the cases wherein we need to query the records, we need to update the records, or we need to delete the records. So that would always be the last resort, and still we need the server side for it. Now, in our requirement, what would be the component? So we are linking this back to our requirement. So this is what we need to build. We need to build a search application which has the ability to search users, and users should be presented in either a grid layout or a list layout. So if you see, the first component is the first red boundary that you see. So this is your first component. This is your parent component which will contain the other child components. So I am calling this the custom search parent component. Now the second component is this tile component. If you see, we are using the same tile for multiple search results. So for the reusability concept, we are using this tile as a single component. So this would be our second custom component, which would be the custom child tile component. The third component is the list layout. Now for the list layout, we don't need to create a custom component because there is already a standard base component available, which is the data table component. Now this is very important. If you have a standard component already available, it makes no sense to create a custom component. So when I was working on this requirement, I was aware which all standard components are already available, and I'll use it to my use case. So that is why I'll not create a custom component for this use case. I'll only create 2 custom components and utilize 1 standard component. Now going to the second building block, which was events. Now we have identified the components, but these components need to work together. So once you have rendered the search results, you need to tell the parent component that I have rendered the search results, or for any other use case. Now by default, the platform itself provides you a list of events, and those events are like to show a toast notification, to navigate to a standard record page. These all are built into the framework. But if you want to create your own custom component to communicate between your components, so you create either a component event or an application event. So these are the only 2 possible types. Now once you create a component event, what's the use of it? The component event is used when you want to communicate between a hierarchy. So if you want to communicate between the child to the parent, you'll use a component event. So in our case, if I want to communicate between the child grid tile component to the parent search component, I'll use a component event. And if I want to communicate from my parent component, which was the search component, to any other component which is in any other hierarchy in the DOM, I can't use the component event because those are not related by any hierarchy. In such cases, we use application events. So application events are used to communicate between 2 components which are in different hierarchies. So if my parent search component wants to communicate to the utility bar component, I'll use an application event in this case. So we have covered components, we have covered events. I know I'm running a bit fast, but this would be clearer when we'll be seeing the demo. The last building block was Salesforce Lightning Design System, which we are calling SLDS. So SLDS stands for Salesforce Lightning Design System. Now this is a standard based design system which is built into the framework. So for any use case, for example, if you are creating a button, you are creating a text box, you want to make it compatible to the standard Lightning experience, you have all that markup and classes available on the standard Lightning design system. You can just utilize those classes and your UI would look identical to the standard Lightning experience. Now it's not just that it makes your UI beautiful, it has advanced functionalities like responsive UI. So if any one of you has worked with Bootstrap, it provides you similar functionality like Bootstrap. So you have a grid system in place in this standard Lightning design system, which can make your UI responsive enough to work perfectly on an Android phone or an iPhone, on a tab as well as on a desktop. So your UI is properly responsive to the to the screen it's being rendered upon, and just by using the standard CSS classes. So we have covered components, events and SLDS. Now we have covered all these building blocks, but we had a step 3 when we were building the requirement. That step 3 was for your admin to drag your component onto an app page so that it's available to the user. But how would the framework know which component has been created for which use case? For that, we use platform interfaces. So platform interfaces is to let the framework know that this component has been created for this use case. For example, if you are creating a component for a record home page, you'll implement a platform interface. If you see the underlined over here, in your component, you'll implement a platform interface called FlexiPage available for record home. This way, when you'll be editing a record home page in Lightning App Builder, you'll get your component available in the custom components and you can drag it onto the page. Now this was one use case of platform interfaces, which was to let the framework know what is the use of your component, what it is intended for. The other use case of platform interfaces is when you want to get extra context data from the framework. So let's say you are building a component which has to be used on record home page. Now when your component renders the UI, you want to show the data which is relevant to that record only. You will not show data which is not relevant to that record. For that, you need the record ID. So whenever a page is loaded, your component should be supplied a record ID of the current rendered record. And this can also be achieved by just implementing a platform interface. That platform interface is Force has record ID. So just by implementing Force has record ID, you get the record ID of current record on which your component is being rendered. Now once you have implemented these platform interfaces, you just need to go to the app builder and drag your component onto the app page. Now we have covered all the steps, we have covered all the building blocks. Now we'll go to the demo of our sample requirement. So let me start the demo. So if you see this is the application that we built. So if I want to search over here, so this is a search application, which is a Lightning application. It has two pages, which are app pages. So first page is user search and second page is account search. Now our requirement was to search the user. So if I write over here, let's say Nitin Goyal, and I press search, I'll get the Nitin record for it. And if I clear it, I'll again get all the records. So the search is working. The similar search is for account as well. Now this was our requirement. We'll go step by step onto this requirement. So let's start with the first step, which is identifying the components. So if I go to developer console, if you see this is my parent component. I've named it demo component, but it is the search component. So this is my parent component. Now this component is the component which would be placed on the app page. Now if you see, this is the parent component. Inside this, we need to either render the grid UI or the list UI. So for grid UI, we are using this custom component called grid item. Okay, and for the list UI, we are using the standard component, the base component called Lightning data table. Now our custom component is the component that we are seeing, and this component, the grid item. Now if I go to the grid item component, so on the grid item component, what you see is, this is just to show the single tile of user that you are seeing. Now this component doesn't implement any platform interface because it is a child component. It would not be used directly. Now these were the components. So step 1 is covered. Now step 2. What I want is, whenever I search any records, so if you see over here, whenever a component is, whenever I'm rendering the components, I want to show the success message. So whenever I search over here, if you see, if I type test and I press enter, you see a notification called search complete. Now this is coming from application event, which is being subscribed by this notification bar component. Now these are not related to each other. These are in separate hierarchies, but still these are able to communicate with each other because these are using application event. Now if I show that application event in developer console, so this is my application event, and this application event has been registered by my parent component. So my parent component registered this component and fires this component from the JavaScript controller. And the notification component that you are seeing in the bottom bar, the utility bar, is subscribing to the same event. So it's handling that event. That is how we are communicating between two different hierarchy components. Now application event was this. What about component event? Now let's say on the grid item, I click on follow button. And when I click on follow button, I want to let the parent search component know that user has followed something. So let me clear this once. And if I click on follow, I'll be firing a notification called you are now following this record. This event is being fired from the grid tile component to the parent search component. Now if you see this over here, so in my grid item component, I am registering an event called success component event, and this success component event is over here. If I show you this is the component event. So only the type differs, rest all the declaration is same. Now if I go to the component event subscription on the parent component, you will see that it has a handler for this success component event. So that is how we are showing a toast notification. Now how we are showing a toast notification, that is another thing to discuss. So if you see, I'll go to the notification component. If you see the notification component in the controller, I am firing a standard event called force.showToast. Now this is example of standard base event which you get from the framework itself. I am just firing this event with certain attributes, and I see the notification on the screen. Now we have covered components, we have covered events. Now we'll go to the SLDS. So if you see on my demo component, if you see over here, I'm using certain classes like SLDS size 1 of 1, right? And I'm also using classes on grid item component like SLDS size 1 of 1, 1 of 3 and 1 of 4. What this indicates is when there is a large display, I want to show 4 tiles. When there is a smaller display, I want to show 3 tiles. And when it's a very small display like a phone display, I want to show 1 tile in 1 row. And that is what happens over here. If I minimize the screen, you see when screen is smaller, I see only 1 tile. If I expand it a bit, I'll see 3 tiles. And if it's a full screen, you'll see 4 tiles. So that is how responsive UI works just by using certain CSS classes. So we have covered SLDS as well. Now the last thing which is remaining is the platform interfaces. Now to understand platform interfaces, first we'll see how these components were added to the app pages. So I have opened the app builder already. How you can open the app builder is just go to this page, click over here and click on edit page. It will take you to this page, which is the app builder page. Now in app builder, if you scroll down over here, I see 3 components. And why I see these components? Because these are implementing a platform interface. Now your admin can just drag and drop this component onto the app page and then he gets certain configuration attributes. Now from where does this configuration attribute come? This is where the design file comes into picture, which we discussed in the component bundle. So if I go back to developer console, first I'll show you I am implementing platform interfaces. So if you go on the top, I am implementing flexi page available for all page types. That is why I see the component in Lightning App Builder. Now, in this demo component itself, if I am able to expand this bar, Control Shift 2, Command Shift 2, I guess. Just give me 1 second, I am not able to access this. Okay, I'll try refresh once. Yes, thank you for the suggestion. So if I go to this design file, you'll see I am exposing certain attributes. And why I am exposing these? Because once we have built the search component, we'll use the search component, same search component for user as well as for account. Now that is where reusability is being used. If you see, I have built component once, I have exposed certain attributes like object name, object API name, grid UI or list UI, and allow follow or don't allow follow. So if you see on this app builder, I see the same attributes exposed over here. And that is how for user, I am providing the object label as user, object API name as user, as well as if I uncheck this grid UI, I'll see the list UI by default. So this is what admin would be configuring. And if I uncheck the follow button would go away. This is how you can make your component configurable enough so that admin can achieve all the use cases that he has. Additionally, for account, I'm just changing the object name to account and the object API name to account. So this is just a label. What matters is this. So I'm changing the API name to account. That is how I'm able to search the accounts. How this is implemented on our developer end, if you see, I am linking these design attributes to the component attributes. So for every design attribute, the name is equivalent to the name of my components attribute. So I have object API name, object name over here as well. That is how the supplied value comes onto here, and then I'm using it in my Apex controller. So my Apex controller is dynamic enough to get the object name and then create a query on based of it. So now we have covered the demo. Let's go back to the slides. Now when you are working with Lightning, it's very important that you enhance your debugging skills, because with JavaScript it's very difficult to debug an issue. It's not as simple as we get through the debug logs, because in JavaScript syntax error is very common. So that is where first thing you should do if you are facing an issue is check your code into a JavaScript validator. So run your code into a validator to see if you have missed a comma or a bracket or something like that. Else what you can do is you can install this Lightning Inspector Chrome extension. This extension enables you to see all the events that are fired, all the actions that are occurring in the life cycle of your application onto your inspect bar. Now the next thing you can do is try to inspect and debug your code into the developer console itself, into the browser itself. So if you go to the browser, if I'll go escape again. If I see over here, I can just do inspect over here, go to source, and I can see my JavaScript code. I can just add a debugger wherever I want and then run the application and debug the code dynamically. This really helps because you are debugging your code while it's running. So you can see the dynamic values, you can see where the value is being supplied, what value is being supplied. That is how it helps. The third thing is disable the cache. With Lightning, it's very common. You make the changes, you don't see it on the UI with one refresh because Lightning uses cache very heavily. So you make sure in sandbox you disable your cache and don't do it in production because else your user would see a slower loading of the page. Last thing is the standard component library. If I was not updated about standard component library, I would not have known that there is already a component available for list UI. So this is very important that you keep yourself updated with the standard library for each and every release. The last thing is, since you have already done this session, you can go to this Trailhead badge, which is build flexible apps, and try building your own component. This badge helps you step by step for all the component related steps. That's it. If you have any questions, please let me know. Any questions? If no questions, I can ask questions. Yes, please.
Hello. Okay, so when you say component events follow a particular hierarchy, so I mean, how do we define the hierarchy? Because if there's a parent component, suppose A, and it contains B and C as its child component, and C is firing up the component event, the B doesn't listens to this one and it goes to A. So how do we define the following as an hierarchy?
So that is what, first of all, if B and C are a child of the same component, those are not in a hierarchy because those are siblings of each other. Hierarchy means when you are talking about a parent and a child. So when you are firing an event from child, its parent would listen it, but not the sibling. So that is how the hierarchy works. You need to be in the body of the parent component. So in our case, the search component contained the grid tile component. So those were direct child and parent. If there would have been one more component, that would have been the sibling of grid child component.
So in case of sibling, how do we generally interact? I mean, component event also can be used in there.
So in case of sibling, you can create aura methods and you can communicate between parent and the sibling, both the siblings. So if there is a aura method on the siblings, the parent can communicate between both the child components.
And one more concept falls in there, like include facets. We
include facets. Yes, that is a very advanced concept. Once you are done with the hands-on of Lightning components, facets comes at a very advanced end. Like even I have never been using facets in my development for the client requirements. Facets is a very advanced component concept. So I don't have a hands-on on it.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Next.
Any other questions?
Is there any way to communicate between parents to child?
Yes, for parent to child, first thing is you'll use attributes. So if I'll go back to that, I don't think we have time for the slides now.
No,
but
in multiple hierarchy like parent to grandchild.
Parent to grandchild?
Yes.
So in case there would be aura method on the child component and parent can call that aura method.
Like it's a lengthy method.
Sorry?
We have a long hierarchy, then we use aura method again and again.
So in long hierarchy, then if the hierarchy is too long, you can use application event in all cases. If you want to communicate directly.
Parent to child.
Sorry?
Is application event travel from parent to child?
Application event travels for all hierarchies. Application event is just a communication between two components. It doesn't matter if those are in hierarchy or not.
Just to add to the point, wouldn't be possible for when we are communicating from a parent to a child, let's say his case, the list is too long, the hierarchy is too long. So let's say we have a grandchild and grandchild has a aura method So the parent can easily call the method of the grandchild, right?
No, the parent would not directly be able to access the grandchild because grandchild would be in body of the child component, right?
So only the direct parent would be able to call the method.
Access the aura method.
Aura method.
Yes.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Done?
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good. We have a goodies for 2 best queries. So Nitin will decide.
So please give one to the guy at the last, Vivek, and one to the guy over here. Thank you.
Thanks Nitin.